Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Quiet Riot. Hello and welcome back to a bite-sized Quiet Riot with me, Naomi Smith. I am just beginning this show with a little health warning about the sound of today's episode. We've had to record it in 2 different chunks because of Wi-Fi connection issues. So if there is a slight difference in the sound quality between different parts of the interview, that is why. Please forgive us. These things can't be helped. And we will hopefully return to more seamless service very soon in the future. Thank you for your patience. And with the first budget of the new government looming, there's been huge speculation about fiscal rules, fresh austerity, question marks over tax rises, and successive governments have repeatedly focused on the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And that is no more evident than when we look at major infrastructure. The paucity of long-term planning for our infrastructure needs, the lack of strategy for managing population change, and the seeming inability, or is it willful ignorance, to consider the interconnectedness of different government functions, how education supports transport, supports housing, supports trade, supports growth, frankly, drives me mad. Someone who thinks about these things from a whole systems perspective is perhaps unsurprisingly an engineer. But he's also a podcaster, a writer, and I'd argue, even if he doesn't describe himself as such, a campaigner. So I'm delighted he's joining Quiet Riot today to tell us why, if the government can get the railways right, our future will look a lot less bleak and potentially even rosy. So a huge welcome to the show. It's Gareth Dennis. Hi, Gareth.
Hello.
You're very welcome. Your new book is called How the Railways Will Fix the Future. I loved it. Everyone should read it. We will link to it. But in fact, much of the book focuses on their past. And one anecdote in particular helped me appreciate the extent to which the railways and those who work them has shaped modern Britain. And that was how the Great Western Rail Medical Fund became something rather bigger. Gareth, can you tell listeners what I'm referring to?
The Great Western Railway, back in 1847, the workers were increasingly getting injured and kind of decided to come together and create a medical fund, the Medical Fund Society. And that started with workers paying a small subscription, and they got free medical care by a local sort of physician, as they would have been called then. And by, roll on 50 years or so, and this had fairly quickly developed into a body that had its own hospitals. It opened Britain's first medical centre in 1892. By the time the Second World War had been won, many tens of thousands of sick and injured people returned to the UK. And we realised as a country that we needed to do something about that. And there had been plans from both sides of the House on what that might look like. So a national health service of some kind. But the model for that was kind of being argued over, and the kind of the father, if you like, of the modern NHS, Aneurin Bevan, said of that GWR Medical Fund, there it was, a complete health service. I won't try and do his Welsh accent. All we had to do was expand it to embrace the whole country. And so this GWR Medical Fund, which had been created on a smallish scale for, thousands of workers in Swindon, halfway between the southwest and London, became the model that the NHS was based on. And so in a way, it's one example of the railways giving us some of the better things that we can think about in this country. One of the things that we can be most proud of, if not the thing we can be most proud of, is the NHS. So, yeah, it's an interesting anecdote. And I do talk about a lot of things in the past, but generally in framing the way that we can think about the future. And in a way, that's what the book's about, is using railways to frame the past and the future, hopefully in a way that's quite useful.
It's such a lovely way to knit our history together and to help readers understand why you've chosen the railways to make wider points about how we should structure the world we live in. So thank you for that. Gareth, no one could call you a Luddite, far from it. But the book certainly emits a frustration from you about governments being distracted by shiny new things rather than cherishing tried and tested products. And you use acronyms AM and FM for actual machines, e.g. the railways, and fucking magic for things like hyperloops. And that really did make me chuckle. And you're very concerned that governments could lose us a diamond while chasing the glitter, not least because of how much the railways help us with some of the biggest existential threats we face. And of course, the main one being climate change. Tell us a bit more about that.
I mean, almost you can stick with the NHS as an example of what FM actually is. So AM versus FM. AM might be funding the NHS properly, reinstating bursaries for nurses, all this sorts of stuff, getting rid of the aero chocolate, concrete, building extra hospitals, actual stuff that we know makes the NHS better. So funding, and also, funding social care so the NHS stops being the public service of last resort. That's AM stuff. And the trouble with that is it all costs money, whereas FM stuff, like saying you're going to reform the NHS and make it more efficient by using AI, which is fucking magic, by the way, that's a thing that doesn't involve money and sounds magical and sounds like it can solve things without any real commitment from government. And therefore, governments generally they like the FM stuff because they don't have to commit anything real. And that's the problem. And, so we continue that in the NHS, but if you look at railways and transport, the trouble with railways is that they exist and people know what they look like. They know what construction of railways looks like, which is big, messy, requires political commitment, which is a thing that the UK in particular is really struggles with committing to anything politically whatsoever. The transport, we know the trouble with sticking with solutions we know is that they look ugly and they require a political backbone. Whereas FM stuff like autonomous vehicles or Hyperloop, or even things like saying you can avoid electrification of a railway by using batteries and hydrogen. This FM stuff allows government to avoid committing to anything, avoid investment, and suggest that the future is just round the corner if we just wait for it, and a wizard will fix it type condition. And that's a real problem because it stops us using the solutions we have today. Things like carbon capture and storage doesn't work at scale. Limited applications for things like industry, like steel and concrete manufacture. But in terms of carbon capture and storage for energy generation, it's just not a proven. It's rubbish. It's FM. Whereas actually the thing to do is to if we want to, for example, the government's spending £22 billion on carbon capture and storage. That's often, by the way, the stuff that's FM is often being lobbied for by incumbent power. So the automotive industry, for example, often you find it behind things like autonomous vehicles because it means they sell more cars, they get people out of public transport, or they reduce investment in public transport. Likewise, the fossil fuel industry is very keen on carbon capture and storage, as you might imagine, because that means they get to continue burning fossil fuels and then therefore charging people for them. So FM is often a way to entrench existing power as well, which is a problem when actually what you want is massive shift of the way we move around, for example, to be socialized into public transport because that's the most efficient way to move people around. Having a 2-ton box full of minerals, metals and such, lithium, for example, to move 1.5 people on average around is much less efficient than a coach that carries, a railway coach that carries 100 people.
Talk to us about the carbon impact and the extent to which rail is so much cleaner than car, coach, other forms of transport. I mean, certainly air.
The numbers are staggering in the difference, and it's not just the emissions. So lots of people talk about electric vehicles as in cars, electric cars being the future. And in fact, the current government policy in the UK is essentially a status quo switch from petrol and diesel cars to electric cars. And that even the Climate Change Committee, which holds government to account on this stuff, basically sort of endorses that position. The trouble is that completely ignores the embodied carbon of building all these cars, all these extra cars. Also, the geopolitical implications of relying on the lithium and the cobalt that goes into the batteries. By the way, all cobalt supplies across the world, including in my phone that I'm speaking into right now, including in everyone's MacBooks or whatever it is, including in every electric car out there, includes cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which involves child slavery. So child labor has put the cobalt into your lithium-ion battery. That's true for everyone because it goes into a big mix that it's very difficult to split out and separate out. So there are serious problems with relying on these complex and challenging minerals not to mention the environmental impact of lithium mining and so on and so on. But the carbon impact alone is HS2, high-speed 2 railway in the UK, as a project, it's embodied carbon. So its whole life carbon is about 1.5 months of road transport emissions. So about 14, 15, 16 million tons of CO2. In order to switch just once every single internal combustion engine car to being an electric car is about 400 to 600 million tons of CO2. So that's 40 to 50 times more carbon just to switch all. It's staggering amounts of embodied carbon in creating these. And it's not to say that electric vehicles, electric cars aren't the future of cars, but they cannot be the future of our mobility. We have to rethink the way we move around, not least from all the damage that having a car-centric society has done to our civilization in terms of, loneliness and wrecking our public realm and
our health. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I mentioned earlier my frustration with the lack of spend now, save later attitude of recent governments. And in the book, you do talk about why avoiding investment is expensive. But the book also talks about the fact that the UK spends more per capita on the railway than every country bar Switzerland and Austria of those that the book looks at. So I think the question for you is why are we having to spend so much on a system that so many consumers feel very let down by?
The easy, straightforward answer to that is because we, to use a phrase, kind of steal a phrase, we sweat the asset. So we're squeezing so much capacity out of an unexpanded railway. You're running so many trains on every kilometre of track. We run a very, very intensive railway, an intensive railway that's about, if not more intensive, in fact, quite a bit more intensive than Austria and Switzerland's system. Now, the reason that those countries and the UK have to spend so much is because it's so expensive to get that many trains, to maintain an asset that is that heavily used. It costs more, not just in terms of the fact that you have to spend the money on maintaining the track, but also actually getting onto the railway and fixing it happens in very short stints to keep those trains moving, which means that the cost of doing the work itself is actually higher because you've got to have these great spikes in people going onto the railway rather than it being more spread out. And that's a choice we've made. So we've historic lack of investment in the past means that we have to spend more on maintaining it now, but also that we've chosen to run lots of trains on a very limited network. Now, a couple of things on that. Number one, yes, the way to resolve that is to invest in new railways. So HS2 is an example of part of the story, but not the full picture. So, spreading the load of how trains operate, what services we have, where those trains run, and essentially freeing up capacity on the existing network to run a more straightforward timetable that's perhaps easier to run maintenance on and reduces costs. But also in the future, actually, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we sweat that asset, because from a carbon perspective, you kind of want to make the most of that infrastructure. So for the whole planet-wide, we might well see other countries like France and Germany sweating their asset a bit more like we do anyway. That then raises questions about, well, what are the benefits or disbenefits, rather, of not investing that money in railways? How much more road traffic would there be if we weren't spending that money on railways? So, yeah, it raises quite a few questions, which I do chew through in the book. But yeah, ultimately, the challenge in the UK is that we run a very intensive service on not a massive rail network. So lots of trains on limited tracks, and that's very expensive.
Well, this is it, that you've touched on it. The frustration I so often have is this sort of lack of planning for the future, the increasing the capacity of the network as a whole. We've, on Quiet Riot, touched on our frustrations around what Sunak's government did with the HS2 project. So can we get on to talking about the network as a whole? And the section of your book that probably turned me on most was why planners often embed kind of current travel patterns into future flow and therefore lock in existing patterns rather than planning for future total population movement between different points. And as one example, if HS2 does eventually end up at Euston, it's going to be a few hundred meters away from HS1 at St Pancras. Yet the two don't connect, Gareth. Why? Why do they not connect? Why do we get things like this so wrong?
Oh, there's an episode in and of itself there. Originally, the plan was to connect High Speed 1, so the Channel Tunnel rail link, through King's Cross straight onto the north-facing main lines to eventually be expanded onto high-speed links to the north. And that plan sort of fell through for various reasons, partly because of Stratford being introduced into plan to kickstart kind of redevelopment of that side of London, and also a certain local MP and still MP of that area, Islington, didn't want the amount of destruction that underground station at King's Cross would have caused. I still think that would have been the perfect plan. The then subsequent plans to link HS2 and HS1 were not perfect, and in a way it's probably good that we haven't progressed them because they were rubbish. What's frustrating is the lack of foresight in providing a better solution, because it does make sense to have a link, even if it isn't even if it's only a small number of trains that would actually continue through. It makes sense to future plan that link between the two quite separate bits of railway, and it's frustrating we haven't done that. And yeah, this whole idea of us not thinking strategically, within the railway planners are cursed by this. And partly driven this way by Treasury thinking of this incrementalism of going, well, if we can put all this work in to just increase passenger numbers by like fractional percentages over time, rather than us stepping back and going, how many people currently travel between A and B, and how much of that mobility do we want to enable by rail? What is the percentage uplift we expect as populations change over the period, over the kind of the period we're looking at as well? It's frustrating that we don't do that, because if we did, we might have a much broader, better view of what our rail networks, and in fact, what our overall transport networks should look like. The data's all there. It's not like we need extra data to collect. We have all that origin destination data out there. It's straightforward, and a lot of it is open data. It's straightforward enough to do that modelling. It's frustrating that we don't, and we have this view of, well, how do we just increase the number of seats by some small percentage, rather than we have an enormous climate crisis approaching, and we have to move into a world where a double, if not more, of the number of people who currently travel by train need to be travelling by train, and freight besides as well. So yeah, it's a real problem, and there are reasons for it that I go into in the book in some detail. We could do an entire episode on the HS1, HS2 link. And
this is going to be our problem, Gareth. You and I are going to be able to go on and on and on, and maybe we will have to do a part two. Let's talk about incentives to change behaviour then. I think at the macro level, your book does a great job at talking about the modal targets that need to be set, and you just kind of described that. But let's talk about the cost of train travel for the average consumer. I'm, of course, referring to fares. We can't talk about rail without mentioning this, or the listeners will clog up the comments.
Absolutely, yeah.
You say it's not just the eye-watering sums of train tickets, but the complexity of ticketing that almost ends up having a perverse impact, because those who can most afford the expensive tickets actually end up using the cheaper fares. I guess one example is a wealthy pensioner who can travel off-peak, and those who would most benefit from cheaper travel just often can't take advantage of it. What's the solution? How do we incentivize people to shift away from car and air travel onto rail with a ticketing system that might actually make them want to do that and able to do that?
So we missed the perfect opportunity to think about the whole system from scratch when 5% of passengers were travelling in March 2020. That was the opportunity to just do a Control-Alt-Delete, or a Control-A-Delete on the ticketing system. We didn't do that, which is extremely frustrating. That is basically what we need to do. Our ticketing system literally is the British rail ticketing system. No one's bothered to go in and meddle with it other than adding additional complexity and little extra bits here and there since the British Rail days, because it's such a massive, lumbering, complex system, both in terms of the rules about ticketing and also the physical and software side of things as well, technologically. Just a great heaving mess, and we just need to bin the whole lot and start again. Simplicity, part of the problem is that Treasury don't want to change the ticketing system because they don't want to lose any revenue. Any change to the ticketing, Treasury say no unless they see some revenue benefit to it. So basically extracting more out of travellers rather than less. We have to have a change in attitude about how fares work. And to be honest, again, we can't look at fares in isolation. We have to look at the way that mobility is charged. So we have to look at road pricing as well. And actually tying, where there are not rail or public transport solutions, road pricing can be used to then, not penalise people who have no alternative to drive. But also if you've got a situation where you have a paralleling rail system or a parallel good quality public transport corridor, then you would use road pricing to penalise driving in that situation. So road pricing has to be part of the picture. But in rail alone, simplicity will mean that, well, it'll mean a couple of things. One, it will mean that subsidy of rail fares will have to increase. That's a fact, frankly. Number two, it might mean that we lose those super cheap tickets as well, that actually so we lose those super cheap tickets. But if it means that we have a much lower median fare and that people feel not necessarily that it's cheap, but that they are at least getting value for money, that they're cheap and affordable are two slightly different concepts. I'm not suggesting that we make all rail fares super cheap, but if we make them all affordable so that people can meaningfully afford those rail fares, and also that they are simpler so that you get a ticket and you don't feel like you don't feel like you've competed with someone else to get a cheaper ticket. You don't feel like you've gone through War and Peace to get the ticket. And also you don't feel like you're sat next to someone who's paid a lot less than you for the same experience. That will improve people's perception of the affordability of rail. It's really important that we improve that perception of affordability. And some of that comes from increasing the cost of the alternatives, i.e. driving. But a lot of it comes from that simplicity, like getting rid of the fact that there are 6, 8, 10 different ticketing options, and many of them completely nebulous and impossible to access for most people.
Gareth, I don't want to focus too much on London and HS2 and the Euston impact of it. What do you think should happen at Euston in terms of the number of platforms that should be planned for to allow for future expansion? If you were Transport Secretary, what would you be giving the go-ahead to there?
Yeah, I'd be returning us to the original HS2 Euston plan, which was a 2-phase station construction with the first 6 platforms being delivered as quickly as possible at the far end of the HS2 site, so not connected, so leaving a gap in the middle that would for the really complicated, expensive connection to the existing station. So you almost have 2 separate stations to start with. That was the original plan. So you build 6 platforms to start with, and then the 5 platforms to enable the full service to run in the future, with the legs up to Yorkshire and Manchester, both absolutely critical, by the way. So you get the full 11 platforms in the end, but that's the most cost-effective way to do it. And it should never have been meddled with.
Quiet Riot.
Gareth, you described the redesign of Euston as a station as importing some of the worst bits of the rebuild of Birmingham New Street. And I think you described it as relegating the actual railway bits of the redevelopment to the basement. Now, look, there's probably blame we can apportion to architects, to local authorities, even to central government. But surely, when we're in 2024, how can we still be designing things in the public realm that don't consider permeability and purpose and accessibility in the ways that we would expect of any other modern building?
Yeah, it's certainly in the case of the UK, but unfortunately, this is common across the Anglosphere. Is that we kind of treat the economy like a god. It's like it's today's monotheism, and in that sense, that means that building a railway that serves a public good and therefore can be spectacular and doesn't have to have desperate amounts of development to ameliorate its costs is something we've lost touch with. We've completely lost our grip on delivering that sort of thing. So, in the case of Euston, the reason we're having all this oversight development, the reason we're giving so much power to Lend-Lease as a stakeholder, as a key stakeholder, which they ought not to be, is in a desperate attempt to kind of ameliorate the capital costs of building this thing. Just because Euston Station is in London doesn't mean it's a London-centric discussion we're having, because this is the gateway to the entire rest of the UK. This is the importance by which London sees the rest of the UK and sees the way that people should access much of the rest of the UK, 4 of the rest of the UK's largest cities. Euston should be grand. It should be impressive. It should be spectacular. It should be a bold statement. It should be no holds barred, no expense spared, and yet it's being trapped underneath an enormous concrete raft to allow Lend-Lease to put a load of tower blocks above to be bought by Russian oligarchs or whatever it is, in order that we can pay back some of those, frankly, trivial capital costs. A few billion quid either way. It sounds like these are big numbers, but bearing in mind the whole railway is costing 100 billion or whatever it is. It doesn't matter a huge amount, but about 100 billion. So arguing over 1 or 2 billion either way for me seems trivial anyway, because this is being spread over decades, and therefore for each person in the country a year we're talking about 1 or 2p. It's just trivial amounts of money is the first thing to actually consider for a country of our scale and our overall GDP. So for us to argue about this money for the sake of trapping the station for the future, it feels really short-sighted. And it is that view. The reason it happened is because of that view, that desperate view to minimize capital costs and simply not perceive any long-term future of having a good product.
You talk about this permeability and purpose as being the hallmarks of a good station. I mean, for sure, the current Euston station is about as vile as any station can get, and users that are familiar with it will know about the crush, the stampede, the awful situation with the current advertising boards up instead of departure boards actually giving you the information that you need. In your mind, what are the components of a great station as you describe them? These are the hubs, the nodes that connect up the network. What would a good station need to have?
So when I talk about permeability and purpose, I'm talking about, firstly, the ability of people to flow through the station, but also to flow from one type of transport mode to another. So, ideally from train or onto bus, or from train onto tube, or from train onto walking or cycling, and vice versa, of course, as well. Permeability is not just the ability to move through the station, to move from the concourse onto the train, but it's also to move between modes. And if you think of that as the driving sort of factor, that will help you design the right station. So things like ticket barriers are a problem. They're in the way of that permeability. Things like having a station that's small enough that you have to do a lot more people management, that requires people to go off and hide in, that you kind of ship people off here or ship people off there, or collect them in the concourse because you don't have the right size station to actually allow people to move naturally. Again, these are threats to problems with permeability. The station should be clear what people are there to do. They're there to get on a train. They're there to get off a train. And therefore, the relationship between you having a space that is permeable, but also one that's purposeful. And purposeful also ties in, it should be obvious that it is a station. One of the great designers in the early 20th century of tube stations, Beck included, understood that a station should be very distinct. The tube stations should be very distinctive buildings that were very obvious at street level. They were different to everything around them, so you knew what it was. And not just because it had a roundel on it, although having a distinctive brand is really fundamentally important to having a good public service, believe it or not. It's not just a nice to have, it's a necessary part of a good public service, having good branding. So you've got the roundel, but also the buildings themselves have to be distinctive. They have to stand out. They should not be hidden under a basement or within the basement. They should absolutely be leaping out so that people go, that's a transport hub, that's a railway station, that is where I'm going to catch my train. And that's so key. And what's kind of interesting is that this isn't just working for stations, permeability and purpose. It also works for other user interfaces like online ticket systems, for example, or the tickets themselves, the process, but also the process by which you travel. That permeability, the ability to feel like you're making progress in a journey, is also important. If you're sat on a slow train that feels like, if you're on the train and feeling, oh God, this train is taking forever, that's a function of the way the railway system has been designed. The chances are, if you're feeling that, you're probably you're on a train that ought to be a faster train doing a longer distance in non-stop service rather than and vice versa. If you're on a train that's not stop, if you've got a train that doesn't stop frequently and therefore you're stood on the station not being able to move. So it's not just the buildings, but also the actual service that has to provide, that's part of providing that permeability and purpose. So those two factors are really key, but they work not just for stations, they work for the service, they work for the user interface, and actually they work for other public services as well. So it's not just works, it's quite a nice, and I'll talk about this in the book, and this is true for lots of other things. It's the railways can actually provide us a useful analogy for public services at large and the way that we deliver them.
Well, Euston not linking HS1 and HS2, for me, fails the permeability test. We've already talked about that. Let's not go back over it. But I do want to ask you, in the same kind of vein, what hope might there be for high-speed rail connecting the east and west of the country rather than just everywhere to London?
The hope for it is, at this point, rather thin on the ground, because all of the proposals currently are just to continue modifying the existing railway network, which, as I've been saying for a decade, or certainly loudly in public for 5 years, doesn't work, doesn't give you what you need, is all a case of diminishing returns. You will spend billions and billions for a very low ceiling of additional capacity. So that's depressing. In terms of the long term, though, these things often, they're kind of inevitable. We will have to do this. When we talk about east-west connectivity, the main project at the moment that's critical is linking the cities on the northwest, so Merseyside, Liverpool, Manchester, over the Pennines to Yorkshire, over to Leeds, Bradford, and then beyond to the northeast and across to Hull as well. So that connectivity is critical because the population group there from Liverpool across to Leeds, West Yorkshire, connecting through Manchester, that's a huge population area that challenges, particularly if you consider that it's also kind of grouping in quite a lot of the cities down to Stoke, and almost as a city area almost reaches down to Birmingham in terms of that dense populated area. That is a larger conurbation than London. if you include Birmingham within it, as it could be done with a sufficient high-speed spine. And in terms of our economy being hamstrung by the fact that we just lean on London for everything, if we had an economy that didn't have everything happening in London, then that would be a far greater and more prosperous, successful economy for other people. And it might also diversify the sorts of jobs that we rely on for our economy as well, because, East Midlands, but as well across the Pennines and particularly around Manchester and particularly South Yorkshire as well, actually, a lot of medium and heavy manufacturing. So, we could actually diversify our economy once more, given that we will need medium, light, heavy manufacturing going into the future to have a sustainable future, in terms of all that stuff.
I wish we had more advanced and concrete commitments for fast rail across the country. What about Scotland and Wales, though? I mean, one of the things that never ceases to amaze me is how long it takes to get between Edinburgh and Glasgow, for instance.
And again, we talked about permeability and purpose. One of the challenges is that you have a suburban rail network that's very successful in the form of the kind of the connectivity between and beyond Glasgow and Edinburgh. It's a very successful the only other hub city outside of London, actually, because of how you have 4 or 5 railway connections between those city centres. But all of them run as suburban connections. There is no fast direct link between the two cities, and there should be one. And whether that, again, the challenge of providing that on the existing railway network is that you will have to barrel through a lot of developed areas and stations that have only 2 platforms and 2 tracks. So it's very difficult to deliver an improved fast service. So what actually you might need is to provide a high-speed connection between Glasgow and Edinburgh. And actually, you could achieve that by building almost like a triangle shape between Edinburgh, Glasgow, and facing south to in the long term, we need to have a connection, a high-speed connection southwards from the Scottish Central Belt to connecting up with where HS2 finishes. So actually, you could achieve that quite fairly neatly. Again, the potential is there. Strange enough, a high-speed link between Glasgow and Edinburgh was on the cards until reasonably recently as a proposal, for these very reasons. So it might happen.
Think that if you were a pro-union political party in government, whether you are the Conservatives or the Labour Party, one of the things that you could do would be to say, well, do you know what? If we're not going to do this piece of infrastructure over here in England, maybe we should do something mega in Scotland.
Pulling it back down to Wales, because I want to make sure I do mention Wales as well. One of the challenges at the moment is that the only railway connection from South Wales into England is through the Severn Tunnel, which is really wet because it goes through an underground sort of river. Actually, we would benefit from building a new tunnel paralleling that. And the benefit of that would be that you could build the new tunnel, put everything into the new tunnel, and then completely rebuild the old tunnel as well. And then you'd have 2 shiny tunnels. Again, the advantage of doing that is that you could have one of those tunnels for suburban services and one of the tunnels for long distance services that whiz through quickly to get you into South Wales more rapidly.
Increasing capacity across the whole network.
Absolutely. And key benefits there. Similarly, in North Wales, there are a lot of projects that need to happen in terms of improving suburban capacity into the northeast of Wales. Wrexham, Bidston's a good example. Some of these the challenge of that, though, is that you get into you get into a lot of congestion with dealing with the North Wales main line, which is a strategic long distance route connecting across the north. Again, it still continues to be a strategic route to getting across to the island of Ireland as well. So again, we need to be we need to be thinking long term about what movement we want and then building the network to suit it, rather than going, how can we do little incremental bits here and there, because it will take us too long, and we frankly don't have the time. In terms of our carbon budget, we do not have the time to continue dithering. We have to be thinking bigger, bolder, more strategic.
One final question I've got for you, Gareth, and it is more related to the budget than the climate budget, which is a point incredibly well made and taken on board. And it's a question that I have been asked by other people and have not had a decent answer to. And it's in the discussion about high-speed rail, why the costs per kilometre of high-speed track can vary so wildly between countries. It surely cannot just be the number of bridges and tunnels and mountains that have got to be blasted through. I'm sure I read somewhere that Spain's Venta de Baños León route costs $9 million per kilometre, and the HS2 in the UK is closer to $200 per kilometre. Why is there such huge variation between the cost of delivery in one place versus another?
So there's two main factors at play here, or three actually. There are three main factors. One of them I was going to decide whether or not to, because we've kind of touched on it, but I'll throw it in already. The first one is about scope, and it is related. It's not so much related to tunnels and bridges, but it's more about the fact that the headline cost of HS2 includes everything. It includes massive new stations. It includes the rolling stock. It includes rolling stock depots. And that simply isn't how those projects are costed in Europe, because in mainland Europe, that these projects are part of a strategy, which means that you don't have to have everything all under one pot. You say, well, the high-speed bit of line that connects from just outside that city to just outside that city is called the high-speed line, and everything else is delivered as their own other projects. So the first thing is that we're not comparing similar projects, because, again, with a strategy, you don't need to think of Euston Station as its own, as part of the bigger project. Euston Station would be its own single major project being delivered itself, because we would know strategically that we needed to provide the capacity for the future high speed lines that would be arriving by tunnel, as a separate self-contained project. So that's the first thing. And also in scope, it is true that in the UK, it's not so much about the tunneling outside of through the Chilterns and stuff, because there's loads of tunnels in high speed lines elsewhere. But one thing that is expensive is the approaches into the cities, where those are often in mainland Europe using the massive wide railway corridors that they have, whereas we don't have those. Often our railway corridors are 2 or maybe 4 or sometimes 6, but rarely tracks wide in London, and certainly in the rest of the UK it's mostly just 2 tracks. So we're having to spend a lot of money on approaching those city centre stations, as well as rebuilding them, and all that money goes into the pot. So number 1 is scope. Number 2 is government meddling. The British government is uniquely busybody in its inability to commit to actually building this stuff long term, and in a way this kind of relates to the third point, but that lack of commitment long term is a factor in the Anglosphere, certainly in the UK, that doesn't exist in mainland Europe, again because of that lack of strategic thinking. So that increases costs substantially, because the supply chain has higher prices, because it doesn't expect that the project will actually be seen through. It means that the supply chain is also more expensive anyway, because it doesn't do as many of these projects. So it means that we're not as experienced. These things cost a bit more. All of that lack of commitment has a major impact. Not to mention, Euston's a good example. Government meddling has increased the cost of Euston Station by like £2 or £3 billion, if not more. So, for example, cancelling Crossrail 2, increasing costs at Euston, deciding they were going to switch it from a 2-stage to a 1-stage project, and now it's deciding it's going to be a 2-stage project again. That's added billions to the cost. So we're talking about that's over doubled the cost at Euston Station purely from government meddling. So that's commitment is the second big issue. The third one is probably the most critical, though, is that in the UK, and this is true of other Anglosphere countries in particular, but the UK is dreadful for it, our entire economy is perceived as being based around the gaps and the fractures between the bits of the economy that do stuff. So the perception is that the economic value comes not from the entities that deliver stuff, but from having lots of interfaces between those entities. So this is why we see, the perception that the market, the perception that increased competition delivers efficiencies. Now, in a financialized world, in the financial sector, that has been shown not necessarily to work that well. But when it comes to actually delivering physical infrastructure, having 200 or 300 or 1,000 different companies all delivering one project, think how many lawyers, think how many contracts that have to be negotiated, think how many, just simply the lines of communication and all the processes you have to put in place to allow the communication. That is hugely inefficient. And in mainland Europe, we see, and this is not just me going on a soapbox rant, this KPMG and Deloitte and PwC have all reported on this being a factor in the UK construction industry, because we rely hugely on SMEs, we rely hugely on lots of tier 2, 3, 4 suppliers, rather than just having one big contractor that does everything in-house. That increases a lot of cost. But also related to that is government not having any expertise internally. That also means that they have to outsource all of their own, what should be delivered in-house. So things like early stage design, scope management, stakeholder management, that's all ends up getting outsourced. That also adds cost. So that's a major factor in the cost increase, is the fact that we have such a shattered economy in terms of all the different companies and bits that deliver stuff. That isn't the case in mainland Europe. Spain's a good example. You have 1 or 2 major contractors that just deliver everything in-house. They don't bring all their staff in under separate contracts. They don't bring all their machinery in under separate contracts. They do it all in-house. And that is a major factor. So the 3 factors are, firstly, it's scope, secondly, it's commitment, and thirdly, it's that fractured nature of the way that we think our economy is supposed to work. And as we see by the fact that we cannot build anything in this country, that we struggle to deliver public services, it doesn't work.
Well, I now feel better informed, but a little bit more depressed. So thank you for that answer. And Gareth, look, I could seriously go on all day interviewing you. It is such a pleasure to interview somebody not only expert, but just so incredibly enthusiastic about their subject and how it fits within the world that we live in, the society we want to build, and the existential crises that we face as a species. Thank you ever so much for joining me today on Quiet Riot.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners, please do go and pre-order Gareth's book, How the Railways Will Fix the Future. The links will be in the show notes. We've only covered a tiny fraction of the book today. I know it feels like we covered a lot, but I promise you there's far more detail in there, and it is very much worth your time going to have a read. And if you'd like to hear Gareth's musings in podcast format, you can find him at the podcast Rail Natter. Thank you all for tuning in. Please do leave us a review, like and subscribe, and we'll be back again with another show very soon. Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alexandreo and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita. Artwork by Simona Canellu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.